So I just Googled the word garbage and looked for the definition, and it said something like worthless, meaningless products or materials. So for me, good garbage, is no garbage. Like we shouldn't have worthless stuff, even if it comes to the end of a certain use cycle.
Hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? Sander and I connected some time back as he took notice of the disruption that we were bringing in the flexible packaging sphere and connected with us. We had a wide-ranging conversation around the work that was being done. And by the end of the call, I was really convinced that I had to invite him and have him on the show. Sander Defruyt leads the New Plastic Economy initiative at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. The foundation is behind the term circular economy and has been a force of change in the global stage. We get to speak about the challenges we face as humankind and the positive work that is being done globally. Sander's canvas is large, and we get a wide perspective on the possibilities that are emerging. Enjoy and learn. Hello. I'm so happy today to have Sander Defruyt, the lead of New Plastics Economy initiative at Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Thank you, Sander, for joining the conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great. I'm going to start with this title that you have, the lead of New Plastic Economy initiative. It's a pretty mouthful of a title, and I'm sure there is a lot attached to that. So talk to us about the title.
Yeah, I mean, at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we started our New Plastics Economy initiative back in 2016, and that's the initiative I'm leading. So that's the short version of what the title says. But yeah, that initiative is trying to really bring the whole plastics economy, plastic value chain together and transform it from a very linear and wasteful system as it is today to a circular one. It's really working with that whole value chain and all stakeholders towards that. That's really in a nutshell what we're aiming for.
We're definitely going to dig into a lot of that. But let's start with you, Sander, the person,
Yep.
because you and I have talked before, but we never got to the idea of, how did this happen in the sense of, were there influences as you were growing up? Where did you grow up? And then, of course, you've had this career where you've done engineering, you've gone into consulting, and then ended up with Ellen. So that'll be great to hear. It'll be great to hear what the influences were that led you to where you are today.
Yeah, it's actually hard to say, like especially at a young age. I would say until the age of 18, I don't remember having any particular interest, or major kind of concern or focus on sustainability topics, etc. Never really crossed my mind. I was deep into basketball, and my mind was really focused on that. But the first memories I have is more like when I was at uni and indeed studied engineering, and as an engineer, very facts driven, and if you just start reading some facts on climate change, on waste, etc., I quickly started to see like, oh, this is not looking good. We have a major problem here, and solving problems is what I really like. And that's why after my engineering studies, I went to McKinsey and Companies, consultancy firm, worked as a management consultant for multiple years. During that time period, I was always kind of trying to look for working on projects in the space of sustainability, but turned out that was more than 8 years ago now. Turned out to be incredibly hard. One, because 8 years ago, and I know, and I still have friends at McKinsey, etc. It has definitely evolved quite a bit. But 8 years ago, sustainability in many companies was still a bit of a something in a corner on the side, right? So paying McKinsey fees, which are quite high for sustainability, was not something many companies would do. So the amount of projects was extremely low. But the amount of consultants of my generation wanting to work on them was extremely high. You could subscribe for email lists within McKinsey. If you're interested in certain topics, you get an email if there's a new project on that topic. So interestingly, in when I was there, my generation of kind of young consultants, associates, etc., that email list was the one with the most subscribed people in all of McKinsey, but the one with the least amount of projects. So it was incredibly hard. And then I remember there being a project on kind of sustainable fisheries. Turned out 4,000 consultants from around the world applied, wanting to work on it. No chance of getting into that project because some of them happen to have degrees on marine biology and what have you. So no chance competing with that. But then at some point, after I think was at McKinsey for about 2 years or so, they started McKinsey Center for Business and Environment. And we're looking for a few young consultants to do like a 1 year rotation within McKinsey and join that center. I obviously applied for that and I got selected to do that. And when I was there, I was then talking to the directors who were leading the center, and they said, well, we got again like something like 4,000 applications to do this, but they only needed 2. And I was like, why did you choose me? Because I didn't have to do any interview or anything really. And they said, well, actually, there are 4,000 applicants. They all have the same profile anyway. They have strong records in uni. They have like 1 or 2 years McKinsey experience. So their CV is the same. So we didn't even bother, screening all the CVs. But your name jumped out because I was like, oh, that's the guy who's been sending us emails for 2 years that he really, really keen to work on these topics. So he must be really motivated. Let's just pick him. So the persistence, I guess, paid off. And that's how I then worked for a bit over a year. I think my last period at McKinsey, worked almost exclusively for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation during that rotation, including working on the very first report the foundation did on plastics. And then at the back of that report is how I ended up joining the foundation to build up the initiative that we have running now, building on that report.
Yeah, it's clear that persistence pays. And you're so right that, we do some little work with McKinsey, and there is a huge shift in focus that has happened subsequently. I know that I was in I think, green business. It was mostly focused on energy, but there was a lot of different ideas that were being discussed. And I was there in a conference just 6 months back, and it was super impressive. Obviously, the kind of people McKinsey is able to gather is always interesting. And there were some really interesting papers that were presented. And it was clear that McKinsey was looking at this as something significant, and especially on the energy sector. But I know that they have a full team, at least in the US, on packaging, and within packaging, even a team focused on things like molded fiber now. And that's a smaller team, but it's still a significant focus that has come into it. So when you say basketball, how tall are you?
Not very tall. No, I was physically not made to make it to the very high levels in basketball. But yeah, no, I mean, my dad plays basketball, my mom played basketball, my brother, my dad and brother are still in the, how do you call it, whatever, management of the local basketball club, small club here in the town. So yeah, it's I was born and raised next to the court and on the court. So
it's a beautiful sport.
But I loved it. I was really, really quite obsessed. But yeah, around that age of 18, my knees didn't allow me to continue. So that's when, sadly, I had to stop. But yeah.
No, why I asked you that is because obviously when you are online on a web call, it's very difficult to tell the height. And it's happened to me a couple of times where, you think of a person and of course you get a broad kind of thought that this is, this person must be tall or not tall. But at one point, yeah, I know there was actually another consultant in the sustainability space. And I met him in person and he was 6'5". And there was another financial consultant, again, similar 6'6" or something like that. And it never comes across. I was like, maybe Sander is also like 6'5" or something, and it doesn't come across on the video calls.
No. I'm definitely not tall.
Great, but let's move from basketball and height to the real stuff that we are here to discuss. So you mentioned that Ellen MacArthur involved McKinsey to look at the plastics report. And can you tell us more? Of course, I've heard Ellen's TED Talk and all the work Ellen MacArthur has become such a name to be reckoned with. But tell us more about this whole idea around packaging itself. How did Ellen decide that this is something that they want to focus on significantly, and what is the path that took them to McKinsey doing that report, and then subsequent to that, bringing you in to actually put in a lot more muscle behind this initiative? So it'll be great to hear that whole spiel on how Ellen MacArthur looks at it.
Yeah, it's a story that goes way back to pretty much to the launch of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation back in 2010 2011. So kind of Ellen after had her super successful sailing career, and after that also started to contact on her behalf, but sounds a bit similar to, like, I guess, my journey at engineering, and looking at some of these numbers raises questions. And she always says, like, it felt like once you lifted that stone and you've seen the problem, you can't put the stone back on and just ignore it, right? So she was like, okay, now I know about the problem, I want to know more. So she started talking to many businesses, learning a lot around those sustainability challenges, etc. And then met a few key people with whom she started the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and kind of really created the concept of a circular economy, which at that time didn't exist. There were a lot of elements and building blocks of it that did exist, and that this vision is built on, from kind of the blue economy, the cradle to cradle vision, etc. But putting all of these different elements together in our circular economy vision as we have it now. But that was like high level conceptual vision, and there were big questions around. One is, is that feasible? Two, would it make environmental sense? And three, would it make economic sense? And those three big questions, she said, okay, if McKinsey is the biggest global consultancy in the world to answer some of these kind of big economic questions of, does this economic model make sense, etc., let's go there and ask them, right? And that's how she just went to McKinsey, met one of the directors there, had a chat. Soon they realized there was no budget. There were only big questions, no budget. But still, they called Ellen back to say, actually, we know you don't have budget, but this model and these questions intrigued us so much that we're actually very keen to work with you on this. And that's how it started at the very beginning. And it then led to the first three big reports that the foundation published, which had the very original title, Towards the Circular Economy, Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. But they were published 3 consecutive years at the World Economic Forum, which then really helped give it very big global visibility, in particular in kind of the business and policy community. That's where that relationship has started between those two organizations. Then how do we get into plastics and packaging? Well, actually, that third report, volume 3. So the first one was talking about in the more technical cycle, technical materials. The second one was more about biological cycle and biological materials. But the third one was looking into how supply chains are very global, and how, if you take a car, the materials in there are sourced from many parts of the world. The intermediate components are produced in many different parts of the world, shipped to the other part of the world to be assembled, and the amount of companies and organizations involved in that whole value chain is massive. And thinking about what does that mean for the transition to a circular economy, and it was very clear that transitioning at a large scale to a circular economy is really hard for individual organizations to do on their own if your suppliers, your customers, your peers, etc., don't want to play along. So we really need kind of cross value chain collaboration at an unprecedented level. So then the idea was, okay, if that's what we need, can we bring that in practice? Can we pick a value chain and really bring the key players together and start jointly transforming a global supply chain? Quite quickly, plastics and plastic packaging came up as a key value chain to focus on for a few different reasons. I mean, one is it's almost an iconic example of our linear economy, right? It's very visible type of pollution. Two is it's a product, or the packaging is something that almost every person on this planet can relate to. Almost everyone, I mean, very, very large share of the global population is kind of coming into contact with plastic packaging almost every day. And then three, also realizing that it is probably one of the hardest value chains to transform to a circular economy. So if you can do it with this one, there's kind of no excuse for other value chains not to do it. And the reason it's some of the hardest is mainly for economic reasons, right? Like every single packaging unit is just a few grams of plastic with pretty much zero value in and of itself. Plus, they are spread over almost every household on this planet. So the whole economics of bringing that back into a supply chain and circulating that is way more challenging than, let's say, for phones or cars or whatever, where you have way less of them and every single item actually has real value. The amount of rare materials and metals, etc., that's in there have a lot of value. So, and those were a few of the reasons to say let's pick plastic packaging and start bringing that value chain together and try and transform it.
Yeah, and the further complication is, of course, a lot of that 60%, maybe 70% is single use within packaging. So, like I know that Ellen mentions the amount of time is so finite in terms of the metals that we have and the precious materials that we have and the fossil fuels that we have. And, and these materials, they need to also see the input side. But I want to take a step back because I want to understand Ellen MacArthur Foundation more because it's such a name to reckon with. So, talk to us a little more about how Ellen MacArthur Foundation is structured. What are the areas that you guys are looking at? And then, in particular, when you look at the plastic side, as you are doing within the packaging side, or the other way around, the packaging side and within that, the plastic side, how is that structured? How do you divide people? And what are the focus areas that each team then works on?
Yeah, so our mission as a foundation is to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. So that's the whole global economy in the end, and not just plastics. But to do that, we know we need to push many different buttons at the same time, and that's what we're trying to do and doing. So one really key thing that we do is working with the players in the system, because to change the system, we really believe we need to work with the key players, the influential nodes in the system. So big focus is working with industry and major industry players, again on packaging, but also many others. We work with automotive players, with big financial institutions, etc. So major businesses, working actively with them on everything from collaborative projects, but also kind of advising on their circular economy strategies, things like that. A second big pillar is our work with institutions and policymakers, where think about organizations like the G20 and the G7 or the UN. There you have now Latin America Circular Economy Coalition, where Latin American countries coming together. You have the same in Africa, etc. So working with those policymakers and institutions. OECD is another one we work quite closely with, and we don't engage super actively in policy at like a national or country level. We're not set up as an organization with many offices in many countries around the world to do that. So we work more at a kind of global, regional level through those kind of institutions. But we do know that, anecdotally, that many of our work is seen and read also at national policy level by many policymakers. So there we try to provide relevant content, vision, and insights to inform policymakers, rather than do actual kind of active lobbying or policy, being super policy prescriptive, but we really do provide them relevant insights to inform policy making. And then we also have a whole part of the organization that's focused on learning and communication. And because the circular economy concept, I mean, in particular when we started in 2010, again, that concept didn't really exist. And it's interesting if you just see the charting kind of Google Analytics of how often the term circular economy was used, from nearly nothing to now. Now you have circular economy in many countries' national plans that they are submitting to the Paris Agreement, and many other regulations, many business strategies. And so now it's a concept that exists, but there's a lot of communication and learning that is needed for people to truly understand circular economy, right? Because I guess that's still, the concept is widely used now, but if you would look a bit deeper in the context it is used, very, very often it's still reduced to the very narrow concept of recycling, and not the much broader concept that the circular economy is, in terms of the biocycle, in terms of regenerating nature, in terms of also reuse and redesigning and eliminating waste. So that learning has both learning programs for businesses, where businesses can put hundreds or many of their employees through learning courses on circular economy and what that means for finance and for marketing and for different parts of their business. But we've also done work with schools and universities on integrating circular economy in their curricula. Yeah, things like that. And now we're looking more into kind of also video and other content, again, just to spread the concept and increase the global understanding of circular economy as a key solution framework to some of the big problems we're facing with waste and climate change and biodiversity, etc.
And I think all three that you mentioned in terms of the industry interaction, policy, and learning, I think they're so intermingled in a way. You
Yeah.
can't you can't influence one without the other because it's so interconnected. In terms of just the team structure, people, do you guys divide it by these three areas, or there is a lot of intermingling between that as well? Like you, as the person looking at the plastic side or alternatives to plastic side, would you also dabble in, say, learning and policy, or would you focus on industry? How's the foundation structured that way?
The structure is a bit of a mix. Like, you can't say we're exactly structured like that of business, policy, and learning, because we also have teams like my team that's just plastics, and that makes use of all of these other teams. And because, as you say, to change the plastic system, we are working a lot with industry, we are working a lot with policymakers, and there is learning to be done. So yeah, the structure is a bit mixed. I mean, we do have policy and institutions team, we do have kind of a learning team, etc., and then we have a business network. So we do have those pillars, but then we have a separate team on a few topical areas, plastics being the biggest one, but then also on kind of food and regenerating nature has a dedicated team as well. But all of us then really leveraging our business and policy and learning teams to achieve our goals. But yeah, we're about roughly 200 people or so, with the majority based in the UK. And then we have small offices in Belgium, where I am, where we have about 7 people or so, and then roughly the same size also in China, US, and Brazil. So we don't have huge amount of offices, and those regional offices are fairly small, and the majority of the people sit in the UK.
Well, thank you for providing that context. It just makes it easier to understand the organization itself. But okay, you mentioned these two words, circular economy, of course, a few times, and then you've mentioned cradle to cradle also. So do you use that interchangeably, or there's a difference between those two terms? And because the central aspect of Ellen MacArthur's work seems to be around circularity, what does that signify? What does that mean for you in an ideal state?
The concept of circular economy is really built and informed and inspired by things like cradle to cradle, but also blue economy, performance economy, etc. I guess maybe one of the differences, I guess cradle to cradle is really focused on the material element of that economy, while in circular economy there's also the word economy, right? That's very important. So there's also a big focus on that, where things like the performance economy come in, and like, how do we maybe completely change business models rather than selling and buying products? What about leasing products? What about reuse models? What about completely different business models? So yeah, what does the circular economy mean? I mean, the easiest way to describe it is always to kind of compare it to the linear economy, right? If you just look at today's economy and you try to draw that on a piece of paper in a diagram, it's just like we take resources out of our ecosystem, we make some product with it, we use it sometimes for very short and single use, and then we discard it in a landfill, in an incinerator, or even worse, in the environment. And that's how the majority of our economy works today. A circular economy is in that sense very different, where you really try and minimize and reduce as much as possible any resources, definitely any finite resources that you need to take out of our ecosystems. And the renewable materials you have to take out are taken out in a regenerative way, in a way that nature is able to regenerate, to then really make maximum use of all these resources in the economy, circulating them in the economy. And that involves things like making products, and here it's important to stress that that doesn't just mean recycling, because within that, recycling really is the last resort solution. It's part of the solution, but it's really the very last step. It started with, how you design your products, your business models, your systems, because many people think about products and how we design our phones and our packaging and our TVs, but it's also about how do you design your cities and your mobility system, because all of that plays a role. So it's really design of systems, products, packaging, materials, like at all of these levels, design plays a very key role, because that then defines how long products can be used in terms of durability, how many products you need, how much they're reused, and then at a, again, last resort, recycled. Yeah, that's, I know, and therefore you minimize both the inputs and the outputs of that model, and try and circulate materials as much as possible in that economy.
Now, that really takes me well to my next question, which was around recycling. So I'm glad you kind of brought that in, because as soon as you hear circular, somehow at a consumer level, our minds go to, oh, circularity is recycling, and
Yeah.
everybody dumps their garbage in the recycling bin and calls it good. And you mentioned that probably is the last resort. So when you look at, how do you see kind of the recycling idea? What does it mean to you? And in an ideal state, what would it look like for you, the recycling bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is one of the biggest challenges we still have in terms of communicating and increasing the understanding of circular economy. That, again, it's the concept itself has spread massively. The uptake of the concept and the language is enormous, but very, very often still in a narrow interpretation of recycling. I mean, that's gradually already improved over time, but there's still definitely much more room for for improving that further. And for me, we have our kind of circular economy principles of eliminating waste and pollution, and then circulating materials at their highest value and regenerating nature. But now we always add at the end of these three principles, do that by design. And I think that by design is absolutely crucial, because it cannot be an afterthought where you first design something and then afterwards you try and figure out, like, oh, can we recycle it, or maybe can we tweak the design a little bit to make it recyclable, or but that's kind of an afterthought. But how do you think from the start, not like how do I design my car more recyclable, but how do I provide the best mobility to people, right? And cars is maybe part of that, but public transport, other things are other part of that. And if you then go into the car part of the solution, it's like, okay, how is that car designed? Actually, 90% of the time the car is parked and is not being used. Does it even make sense to sell cars? Shouldn't they be shared cars to make actual use of them, and have them be used the majority of the time? Should they be electric cars? And then, of course, there is a part where you get to the actual materials, the design of it. First, to make the car more durable, and that's where, again, the link to the business model is really strong, because if you sell cars, your incentive to make them durable is quite small, because there's no reason why you couldn't design a car that would last 1,000,000 kilometers, but you would just sell way less cars, and buying it at the start would probably be more expensive. So that's really hard in this business model of selling. But if it's a leasing or a sharing model, suddenly you, as a owner of the car fleet, have massive incentives to design it differently, to reduce its energy consumption, to design it durably. And then at the very end, you'll obviously also come to the, every product will at some point come to the end of its life. So you then also have to think about, how do I then design the parts of the car so I can easily disassemble, maybe reuse some of them, recycle the rest. But you'll see there's already a lot of steps of things you think about, from the design of the mobility system to the car, the business model, the until you actually get to the recycling part of design for recycling and actually recycling it. So I guess that again illustrates how recycling is part of, but the last resort solution within the circular economy framework.
And you mentioned incentives, and that's always a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
We can look at, similarly, we can look at fast fashion. There is no incentive to design things that will last a long time. You have to have the new flavor for the day. And us as consumers have been so attracted to the idea of consumption and new and that sort of thing. So, and it's, of course, cars is a much bigger thing, but even a smaller thing like just clothes is such a huge impact that it creates, and we don't realize that. Staying with the idea of recycling, Sander, I want to pick your brains a little bit more, also because I'm fresh from conversation with our common friend who we mentioned before we started recording, Sean Sutherland. And she was very, very clear about this whole recycling idea being an absolute misnomer, especially, and let's switch towards plastics. And her thought was that there are so many chemicals within the packaging material. There is no such thing as a monomaterial called a certain plastic. There is so much intermingling that you cannot possibly recycle it. You can downcycle it, but as Cradle and Cradle would say, everything should be upcycled. That will be an ideal state. So, how do you see it? Let's focus on packaging now. And how do you see this idea of recycling? And what, again, of course, plastics today are at what, 7-8% kind of material is what Sean would say downcycled. But would just like to have your thoughts around that idea.
I mean, I think it's clear that recycling has its limitations, right? And if you look at plastics, you either have mechanical recycling, and you always have some form of quality loss, sometimes a lot, sometimes a bit, but there's always a bit of quality loss. You have chemical recycling technologies who might not have that quality issue, but they have another major issue, which is around yield losses, where for some of these technologies, half of the material is lost through the process, and yes, the other half is recycled at high quality, but you've already lost half of the material. So recycling always comes with losses, and every process comes with losses, right? It's the basic laws of nature, the law of entropy, like that. There will always be losses. If you really lift it to the conceptual, almost philosophical level, you could say if you always have losses, then we at some point just kind of need to shift as much of our economy as possible from the technical cycle to the biological cycle, right? Because biological materials, there it's okay to have losses as long as these losses kind of return back to the environment and help regenerate nature, etc. So in that sense, you could say, should we transition our whole economy to biological materials? So that's at the philosophical level, and I guess there's definitely a lot to say for that trend and for that movement in that direction. Maybe bringing it down a level more practically, it's like, it's not to see a future where everything from our bridges and our roads and our everything, all our houses, will all be made from biological materials. I mean, that's one, we're far away from that. Two, how are we going to source so much biological material in a regenerative way from nature? And of course, we have those technical materials, right? They are there. I mean, some of them are incredibly abundant, and in a way they're all finite, right? But if finite means we can continue for another 10,000 years, then practically speaking, that's not really finite. There's definitely, I think we should be moving over time more towards the biological cycle and biological materials, especially for kind of consumer goods, etc. That being said, the finite materials that we do use, we should of course try and make maximum use of those once we have brought them in our economy. Let's keep them in our economy and make maximal use of that. Again, that's not just recycling, that's making products more durable and designing better, etc. Recycling is, even if it comes with some losses and a quality loss, it's still better. Like if you recycle, let's say whatever PET bottles, if you manage to recycle them even just once, imagine they all were recycled just once, that 50% material saving, right? So that's meaningful. If you do it twice, you have 66% material. So you quickly get significant savings. Of course, as you said, we're far away from that. We're far away from even having every bottle or every, for most other products like clothing or whatever, the numbers are even way worse. So we're far away from even having everything recycled once. And that's also why we shouldn't put all our eggs in the recycling basket, because we know, one, we're far away from it working at large scale, and two, it will always have limitations. So again, let's focus on the more upstream solutions first, and recycling as a last resort. But it will, it will play a part of the solution, and it definitely helps us also save materials in the foreseeable future.
The Good Garbage podcast has been brought to you by Pakka. Pakka has been creating solutions in the food packaging, carry, and service space. Pakka utilizes sugarcane residue and upcycles it into amazing products. Their latest offering is a compostable, flexible packaging solution for the chocolate and confectionery industry. The products are available in the Indian subcontinent and in North America now. Pakka is also building an end-to-end solutions for customers in the food service and delivery space. For any query, do email at connect@pakka.com, and Pakka is Pakka. Now, back to the show. It's really interesting that you mentioned biological design. And you're so right, even when I look at the process side of it, right? Many times as consumers, we are not aware or we don't focus on how something was produced. So even looking at it from, say, our standpoint for what the company I work for, what we do, so we can very loudly claim that we are taking a renewable material that is wasted and converting it to something which is going to be of higher value. But even in our process, when we look at it, the water consumption, and we are one of the lowest, it's 30 meter cubes per ton, which is 30,000 liters, right, per ton of product produced. It's the energy consumption is almost over 1,000 units, 1,000 kilowatt hours per ton. There is a certain amount of emissions that will take place. Yes, we can clean up a certain amount, but there is still emissions that is happening. We can, of course, clean up the effluent, but in the end, there is something going into the water stream. Try as we might, it is not as good as the fresh water we took out from the ground. So we are also damaging the aquifers. And I'm taking a direct example because that I know really well. But of course, every process does that. Now, if I compare it to a biological process, it's very different, right? So even if I look at cellulose, again, the domain that I understand a little bit, you look at a tree, it's just carbon sequestration from the air. The single source of energy is the sun. There is some minerals coming from the ground, but that's it, right? And the beautiful tree is created. And similarly for any packaging, because again, it's either amino acids or sugar chains. How do you see the process side of it? Of course, we can be as critical as we want about the product because that's in our view, in our face. But many times we ignore the process. But as people in the foundation, I think as far as I've interacted with you, you go into significant depth. So how do you see that, and how does one overcome this kind of challenge of process and not just product?
Picking up on what you said at the start there about we kind of sometimes ignore the process and where does that all come from and what's kind of energy and water, etc., went in, and that's probably my engineering background, right? But often, like if I have some product or something in my hands, the two basic questions pop up, like where does it come from, but also where will it go, right? And it's striking that most of the time people never ask that question, right? Like they don't ask the question where does it come from, and probably even less where does it go. But as soon as you start asking that question, very simple question, you see the most ridiculous things being designed. It's like, pick a few of the most ridiculous things, but it's like fake snow, like plastic fake snow. You're like, where will that go? Like if you're designing that product, what do you think will happen with it, right? Consumers using it outside in their whatever in the garden, or like to decorate a Christmas tree, and you think like, what, where do you think those will go, right? There's wind, there's rain, and this is plastic, right? But even other stupid small things like plastic glitters that they put on our kids' face to decorate their face and whatever on a party. And like, well, these are non-biodegradable plastic glitters that are designed with a pure objective in mind to put it on people's face. Have they ever asked the question, where will it go? Like they will shower, it will go in the wastewater, it will like, it's super basic questions. Where does it come from? Where does it go? But if everyone would start asking those questions, I think the world would change dramatically. However, I've given up on that ambition because I don't think, and I've actually said that at several industry conferences as well, where you see a lot of people in. I'm now talking plastic and packaging industry, and where a lot of times like, oh yeah, but the consumer doesn't understand the problem and the solutions, and the where I've been saying at that conference, well, if you will wait until every consumer will understand this problem and the solution, they will never going to solve this, right? We shouldn't expect that from them, because plastic is one problem. You have other problems, completely different ones, on privacy, on human rights, on do you all understand that problem and the solutions? Well, you don't, right? So you can't expect every human to understand every problem and every solutions. What they do understand, that the system is not working and that there's plenty of waste. The system is clearly broken, but it's the responsibility of business and policymakers to fix it, not the responsibility of consumers. Like they can't be responsible for fixing all problems in the world. So we need to go to a world where, as a consumer, you go to a store and there are no wrong choices. Every product has been designed by someone who has taken his responsibility in the design of thinking about where is this coming from, where will this go. And yes, the consumer will always need to play his or her part in that system. And of course, they shouldn't be throwing it out in the environment. They should put it in the right bin, those type of things. But they shouldn't be bothered about the design and about what happens with that bin afterwards. Like, that's the system that industry and policymakers are responsible for designing right.
So there's a young entrepreneur that comes to you, Sander, and says that, I'm going to, and I'm sure this happens to you from time to time, and I want to really design a packaging solution which is right. What would your advice be to them? How should they design? And this is a single-use solution. Say, let's take an example. Say it's a chocolate packaging. So it's still multi-layered, but single-use kind of structure. What would your guidance be to that young entrepreneur? What would the steps be in the current state? What would you do?
I mean, there's a few things in your question already. Is like, the right packaging. Like, I'm not sure you'll necessarily ever get to the right packaging, especially in today's situation. As you said, there's must always be some impact, water use, energy, etc. I mean, again, at least today, I mean, over time, the aspiration should definitely be to have a positive impact and not just to have less negative impact. But so if you will find the right packaging, difficult. And the other thing in the question for me is, and maybe the chocolate bar is a difficult example, but with other products, I would start also lift the question a bit up and say, I want to design the right packaging. It's like, well, actually, you want to deliver chocolate to a consumer, right? You don't want to design the right packaging, because there's, beyond designing the packaging, there's designing the business model. Like, can it be a reuse model? Can I redesign my product differently? Again, with chocolate may be hard, but if it's shampoo or soap or whatever, there's solid versions of it, there's liquid versions of it, there's concentrated versions of it. Like, how can I also design my product and the business model and the packaging, rather than just, and I guess that's what happens a lot in today's design process, right? The product is there, and then they ask people design a packaging around it, right? Rather than, hey, we want to deliver this service or this product or this, to consumers. So opening that solution space is, I think, an important one. Yeah, I mean, what would my advice be? It's not rocket science or very unexpected advice, but it's indeed thinking about everything from how many materials are you using, and where are you sourcing them from? How are you designing your product, and what are the systems in place that can deal with your product after its use, whether it's collection and recycling systems or reuse infrastructure or composting infrastructure, or like what will happen after it. Really think deeply about the two simple questions: where does it come from, and where will it go?
No, I really appreciate your point of view here, because why are you coming and saying that you want to design a packaging? Why not look at the whole system holistically? So there could be many ways, right? Even if the random example I took of chocolate, probably it's top of my head because we've been working on designing that. But like the question is that why should your chocolate be delivered the way it is delivered? Why can it not be in a different structure? Why cannot it be in a reusable system? There are many questions. You're right. It's not just about packaging, it's about what you're trying to deliver. Now, when I come to the more practical side, what we see is that there is a certain convenience that we've gotten used to. And changing that convenience is extremely difficult, or changing habits is extremely difficult. So what you run against is things like shelf life. How does this product XYZ stay for 6 months, a year? How does that happen? And that's in contradiction, right? If it's a simple packaging, like we were talking earlier about natural packaging, like an orange peel or something, it's not going to stay on the shelf for a year. It hardly will stay for a week, in fact. So, especially if it's not got all the electron exciting stuff kind of thing happening in terms of extending its life. So how do you see that part of it? Because we as consumers are so used to things like, we just want to go into a store, pick up something that was created 6 months back, and have it taste as good as it was made yesterday. So that's a huge challenge for anybody creating packaging. How do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two things here that make it really challenging, right? Because as you say, you have ingrained habits, but also ingrained or kind of systems that are put in place. And if I start with the second one, with the systems in place, that's where it comes to that very basic idea that our whole plastic initiative started from, that cross value chain collaboration, right? You as an individual organization, you're part of a value chain, right? And if that value chain is set up in a certain way that your products need to fit in that limits your solution space. And that's why that cross value chain is collaboration is crucial. Like, how can you work with your suppliers, with your peers, the rest of the value chain together, because that allows to really change the system. A nice example here is reuse models, right? Where if you, especially the returnable packaging that goes back to the manufacturer for cleaning, refilling, etc., that model is, maybe with a few exceptions, but really hard to scale as an individual company, because you cannot imagine every single company setting up their own collection schemes and reverse transport and whatever. It will need to be, both for environmental as well as economic reasons, will need to be a shared industry system of collection, also for consumer convenience, right? You can't imagine, oh, this product I need to bring to that spot because it's from that company, and this packaging I need to bring to that place for that. No, that will never work, right? So you need to work together to change the whole system. And another nice example and story, or anecdote that I remember is, in my very early days working on circular economy, I also looked a bit into kind of mobility, and I was talking to one of the big car manufacturers, and I said, yeah, car sharing, and we really want to try it, and we entered that market, but the economics were just not working. But when they started telling the story what they did, it's like, okay, but what car did you use? I was like, oh, well, this car, which is the exact same car as the one they're normally selling to consumers. In that case, they were changing the business model without changing the product design, and the economics didn't work, right? And there are other examples where you do vice versa. You change the product, but not the business model, and it doesn't work. So that's sometimes what makes it difficult. That you need to change everything and go to a completely new model, and then it works. Because if you go to car sharing with a car that's not designed for durability, that does not have certain features of energy efficiency or what have you, that then it's really expensive, right? But if that car was designed very differently from the start, designed to be a shared car, then the story and the economics become very different. So that was part one, is like, you design within a system, so sometimes you feel limited by having to fit in that system. And the second thing is indeed consumer habits. And here I think I genuinely believe there's many circular solutions that are simply better than the linear ones, also for the consumer, that deliver benefits to the consumer that linear ones do not. It obviously, will be dependent case by case and whatever, but if you really put yourself to it, and really change a complete business model, I believe that, for many consumers, car sharing can be way more convenient than, you don't have to do maintenance, you don't have to, people who don't drive the car, you don't have to, pay your insurance and all that, all paperwork you don't have to do. Cars, broken, it's not your car, it's not your problem. It's so many benefits as well to that model. Again, depends on your car usage and your situation, but for many consumers, brings a lot of benefits. Same for certain packaging models and reuse, where you see, we've seen models where reusables are cheaper than the single-use ones, which is a benefit. But interestingly, these benefits are not always marketed. One example, you go to the store, I see in the store. I'm the nerd who goes into the store and taking pictures of all the kind of reusable packages to then analyze the at home. But did like a quick analysis, just took a few pictures on the in the personal care aisle. There were a lot of refill models where you could buy a refill that you can then at home pour into your, either concentrated or not. And I noted down all the prices. And actually, it was on average something like 10% cheaper than buying the normal bottle. But none of them advertised that, right? They were all saying 70% plastic savings, whatever. I think it would be much better if it said 10% cheaper. I mean, for many more consumers, that would be attractive. Like, why is it not? Because I had to use my Excel file to say, this is so many milliliters at that price and the normal bottle. So you have to then start calculating the price per liter and to actually see that it's cheaper. Why is it not saying on the pack, this is 10% cheaper if you buy this and just refill your old bottle? I do think there will also be other areas where maybe you can't find solutions that are massively more beneficial, that are much cheaper or that are more convenient, or again, I don't know the details of any specific example, but can imagine whatever, food service takeaway packaging, trying to do that reuse, like maybe it is slightly less convenient that you have to bring it somewhere rather than just dumping it in your bin, which is super easy. You just don't have to bother and you don't ask the question, where does it go? But in those cases, I think also policy has to play a role, right? In kind of deposit schemes, creating the right incentives. You just level or tilt the playing field through policy to create the right incentives, because there's a lot of externality costs that are not taken into account and therefore don't influence the consumer's choices. But if you do take them into account and start leveling the playing field, that might shift. So yeah, I think both just designing better products and marketing their benefits, and in other areas have policy step in to level the playing field.
There's so much in the last comments that you've made. There's so much to unpack there. I'm going to take a few of them and then ask for further kind of thought process and guidance on that. Do you feel that we, like, even as a company that manufactures stuff, we get jaded? And why I ask you this is that we kind of don't want to challenge the status quo. And you kind of talked about system redesign. And we think about it that, what all are we going to tackle? Do we really want to be on the wrong side of the converter? So what we do is that typically you try and change the product. And why the way you change the product is also a little bit of a lower hanging fruit, where you say that, if a conversion machine currently runs on a plastic polymer, you just replace it with a biodegradable polymer and you have it run on the same machine. You don't want to challenge. But then what has happened is that you've kind of, in a way, reduce the system's thinking immediately, because you're not wanting to look at the entire system at all, because you have been hurt a few times in business by trying to challenge the converter, because the converter has the direct access to the customer and they're going to have a significant influence. Tell me, do you think it's a jaded view when we actually shortchange ourselves, or do you think that's the reality and we have to live with it? How do you see? Or is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean it is somewhere in between, because yes, we absolutely need to change the system, but that's super easy to say, but incredibly hard to do. I mean, it's there's existing supply chains, existing investments that have been made in machinery, in facilities. If you look at circular economy more broadly and like mobility, whatever, like cities are designed the way they are designed, right? That you can over time, as if you are revamping a certain street, you can make adjustments. Or over time, if you do need to make investments in your factories, you can evolve, just from one day to another, saying I'm just going to throw all my machines out of my factory and put new ones. Economically that might be really challenging and might not necessarily be the best idea, but change can happen. I mean, an interesting conversation I had on reuse with some of the brands, they said, well, actually, but that's also a transition that happened over decades, right? But in the past, we had, I don't know the exact number, right? But we had so many, a large amount of factories across, in that case, the conversation was about Europe. So we had so many factories across Europe to fill the products and sell the products, etc. Over time, that all got centralized in like just a handful or even less production facilities that cover all of Europe, with logistic chains that have been built to make that happen, and big warehouses and all of that stuff. So their whole supply chain has been transformed over time. And he was saying, well, actually, if you look at reuse, we should probably somehow reverse that trend again, because we need to have more decentralized filling lines so that the transport logistics of bringing empty packaging back to our, becomes way less, and the both economically and environmentally that's better. So again, they can't from today into tomorrow say, oh, we just shut down certain warehouses, we built 10 new factories again in that region. Like that doesn't happen overnight. But I think it is interesting, and that's maybe where it's important to shift from short-term kind of quarter by quarter financial results thinking to longer. You need longer term thinking to then make, knowing that transition might then again take like a decade or longer, but gradually you go back more decentralized. How do you make sure you have that long-term perspective in mind in everything you plan, and might not always be the optimal decision for your next quarter financial results, but might be for your longer term financial results and for your longer term, for your business. Knowing that there is more consumer pressure, there is more regulation coming there, so you might need to go there anyway. How do you take that into account? So changing the system, easy to say, harder to do, especially in industries where there's a lot of infrastructure and capital invested.
Yeah, I like your thought on, like, don't ignore that thought. At least don't just brush it away that, oh, nothing will change, so let's just kind of plug into the same system. So at least in what the shift that I'm going to make, thanks to you, is that keep questioning that system as well, but not, okay, maybe we need to take one step at a time, and we might introduce an alternative product, but we're not going to stop questioning the system. So I think that's a good takeaway. So thank you for that. The two other things which I wanted to pick on things you mentioned, and again, I'm giving you a practical example. Like, there was a debate happening on which segment to target in the food service space. The one segment was institutional catering, because there you have the possibility of building an entire circular system by providing completely compostable food serviceware, taking that food serviceware and the food waste to a composting system, structure, technology, and removing compost. So, you can build a end-to-end system which will actually see an end of use. The second was, there's so much muck that is happening in the food delivery space. Every container that we see is a polymer that will probably be thrown away. It's a pretty solid, good quality polymer these days, but it'll still be thrown away. So should we change that, knowing that we have no control on how it's disposed? And it's kind of it's in a way a moral kind of dilemma. What do you go for? Because any system that you go for, you can influence. But the challenge in the institutional catering space is it's a lower hanging fruit. The products are pretty simple, so the challenge is not as high in the design of the product, but it is a challenge in the design of the system, which may not be our forte. In the other side, the challenge is in design of the product, but you have no control on how the disposal is going to take place. So how would you tackle this dilemma? Like, what should and a company can only do one at one time. So how would you tackle that? How do you kind of flip the coin on that one?
From a system perspective, both kind of need to happen, right? And both need to change. From an individual company perspective, where to focus, I think, there's multiple elements that might play here, right? There's also probably some business elements. Like, do you have a lot of traction in the institutional catering? Are they interested? Like, because you can focus on that, but if those players are not interested to work with you, then but maybe there's a lot of energy in the food takeaways. So I think there's many factors that play into that. other factors to look at is what's the impact we can have, right? How much packaging is being used in one industry and the other. So I think that's more like feels more like a business decision that's a bit case by case. Both would need to happen, and for both of these, look at what is a solution to go for here, right? And do we go for the compostables with the benefits you mentioned of, easy go with the food, etc., or do we go? Because another thing to say for catering is also that it's more easy to do reuse, right? Because they're not taking the plates and the cutlery or whatever, they're not taking it home, they're eating in. So why not just have just ceramic plates and durable cutlery and use that like a million times? Yeah, assessing that. On the other one where you say like we don't control the system, I guess that's indeed, you don't control it as an individual organization, but that's where that cross value chain, and if we say value chain, we include policymaker, etc., in that, where that's the type of things we also kind of try and do. Right? If you find enough players in a certain industry, if I build on your example, imagine you have in a certain country or region the major takeaway food chains or whatever, or industry associations or whatever in that sector, to all come together and share a vision and maybe all jointly go to policymaker and whatever, maybe you could say, okay, in this city we provide not just a residual bin on the streets, but also a composting bin. And we do a education campaign to the consumer to say everything that's compostable goes in a different bin. And will that system work perfect? Well, no, not no system works perfect, but at least together you can influence the system, right? If you have the main players together, you can change the system. And that actually brings me to an important thought where I do see differences between different companies we work with, where where in some companies you see they're focusing on how do I achieve results with my company in terms, I mean, I'm talking sustainability results here, right? But how do I improve the recyclability, the recycled content, the compostability, like how can I change my company? But we see other companies that have a tendency or a culture to think much more about how do we with our company change the system. And I think that the difficulty here is that people, and now I'm talking individuals in these companies, they get their responsibilities and their tasks and the things they need to deliver, and those goals are typically company goals, right? Our company needs to deliver this, our company needs to, there's probably very few who have a system goal. It's like, actually, your role is not to change our business, your role is to change the system. And you have capacity, because I understand those people that we work with, many of them are super motivated and want to change the system, but it's really hard for them to find the time to invest in building consortia, getting other stakeholders in place, working with the sole purpose or benefit of changing the system, which will benefit their company at some point, but not in kind of, there's no direct short-term results of that for the company. So how do you create in companies the capacity and the room and the mandate for people to actually work on changing the system that your company is part of, is something that we see it can be very different across different companies or types of organizations.
No, and you're right. Like you can't just, if you focus only on your company, you're going to be limited also by the short-term goals. So, you won't look at it holistically and also longer term. The third part, which I wanted to pick on, which you said a few minutes back, was on the side of, how do you create a value proposition? And in the example you gave there was a cost benefit and the company wasn't talking about it. But typically, what I find is that there is an assumption across the value chain. And this could be the producer, the converter, the customer, the consumer. All of them have assumed this fact in a way that says that the sustainable solution is going to be poorer performing and more costly. That's the generic assumption. And I kind of deal with that every day when we talk to our innovators, our R&D guys. And it's always the benchmark is the current polymer, and we are going to produce something that is going to be worse than that, and it's going to cost higher. And I think to myself that, plastics was a waste substrate that some ingenious person took and created value out of. And why are we not doing that today, looking at other materials. How do you tackle that, or how do you see that? How do you see that mindset? And do you see that shift that'll happen in terms of materials, that we're going to have better materials at a lower cost?
Yeah, this is again a great example of, looking at the broader solution space being really important, because if you try to, and that's what we see quite a lot. So you try to design the exact same product with the exact same business model, but just make your materials more recyclable, or kind of more sustainably sourced. And then, maybe that can be more expensive in some cases. I mean, in some cases might be cheaper as well, but you already see like the solution space is very limited, right? You need to produce the exact same but more sustainably. While again, if you look at it more holistically and say, hey, but maybe if I do things differently, the economics change completely. And I know, and we said in the beginning, like packaging is one of the most challenging sectors economically, so it's easier to find examples in other sectors. But if I again take the car example, right? It's like you try to design a car and make it more recyclable, or make it, but that, I don't know if that's more costly or not. Maybe it is. But if you think completely differently, it's like, oh, what if it's a car sharing model or a leasing model, where I have the incentives to design it much more durable, where I, as a producer, get the benefits of making it much more durable, much more easy maintenance, etc. I mean, the amount of money they earn on maintenance is quite significant. So maintenance can be way more easy. If the cost of maintenance would be on the producer, I'm sure the car would suddenly have a few design changes. I mean, I don't know how, and I'm not, a car engineer, but I'm sure that suddenly that creates incentives that don't exist now, that they would suddenly really have to focus much harder on that. So that's again where it's not about trying to produce the same in a more sustainable way. It's about looking more, yeah, more holistically. And that's also where, with packaging, I mean, reuse won't be the solution for all products, but definitely for some products, where trying to design a more sustainable, recyclable packaging, etc., might be more costly. But what if you do it differently? I mean, again, I don't know the economics of this particular solution, but a lot of money has been invested by toothpaste producers to, many years of R&D to find a recyclable toothpaste tube, which they've now, many of them are rolling out in the market. But what if the toothpaste came in tablets that could go into an easy little pot that's easily recyclable? And that also exists, right? With some reason that has not scaled or not picked up. I don't know if that's economic reasons or other reasons, but it's like, yeah, sometimes it's easier to find a solution, in a completely different way than just trying to do the exact same thing more sustainably.
So it's interesting, and I'm going to totally like take a cue from you to diverge a little bit. So in India, I don't know if you know this, but traditionally the way people brush their teeth was a twig of a tree called neem, which has got antiseptic properties. And I remember my dad as well; he used to love it. It's a very bitter twig, but what you do is that you keep chewing it, and you kind of make it like a brush by just pressing it with your teeth, and then that's what you use to clean. So again, taking a cue from what we used to do earlier and a system change, rather than thinking even about, a tablet or a paste or something like you're saying, it could be a totally different. The question is about keeping your teeth clean. It's not even about brushing, right? It's about, even that is a system that somebody kind of set up. And I'm sure 100 years back, there may have been no toothbrushes, and some people use something else, and I'm sure people managed to keep their dental hygiene okay, but obviously you were consuming a lot less processed food and sugars. But that said, again, what you're talking about earlier is of such importance. What is the overall need? And then you design as per need, rather than thinking I'm just replacing the toothpaste, or the toothpaste tube in this case, and look at it more as, how should people be keeping their teeth clean, which is so interesting. And this came to my mind. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. So Ellen MacArthur has had significant impact, especially at the UN level, and the thinking there. There has been the whole SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, where Ellen MacArthur, at least as far as I know, was deeply involved. So talk to us about the system change that you're seeing globally, and how does Ellen MacArthur play a role, and take this forward in the future in order to really have a robust universal system across the world?
Yeah, and maybe I'll here zoom into to packaging and the whole UN negotiations of a global treaty on plastics. But a lot of it is, as I said, we don't necessarily do detailed lobbying or detailed kind of wording and commas in particular policy files or whatever. But we do see many policymakers come to us, reach out to us just to really talk about overall direction and test idea. Like a lot of it is sometimes still fairly simple about repeating the vision, the principles, what's the right direction, and we don't necessarily have all the answers on the detailed points and commas in the actual policy, but just what policymakers really appreciate and value in talking to us is that they know we have deep understanding of through our work with industry of like the real world challenges that the industry is facing and why our solutions not found and what's difficult, what are the barriers, is it economic, technical, whatever, which then helps think about what could be the intervention points to take, right? And if certain solutions are blocked because of the economics not working, and what are the policy solutions, and for example, the whole collection, sorting, recycling of packaging, the economics of that don't work, right? I mean, the cost of the whole cost of collecting, sorting, and recycling packaging, and not just plastic packaging, actually most packaging, the whole cost of that system is much more expensive than the value of the material that comes out in the end. So there's always a need for somehow subsidizing that system, right? All packaging that's recycled is somehow subsidized, right? Either the cities or municipalities are paying for the collection, or very unfortunate, but in many countries where formal waste systems are lacking, the subsidy is just the very very poor waste working conditions and health conditions of those people. Like if they would be paid properly and work in good conditions, the economics wouldn't work. So it only works subsidized by poverty almost, right? So without subsidies, the system doesn't work, and that's where things like EPR policies are absolutely crucial, and the only proven policy we've seen work to make sufficient ongoing funding going into the system to make the economics work. So that's where we help policymakers to kind of see those barriers when it comes to collection and sorting economics, when it comes to flexible packaging, when it comes to reuse, like why is not happening, what are the barriers, what direction of policy interventions could be useful. Very concretely, what we have been doing the past 2-3 years when the global treaty negotiation on plastic started is mobilizing together with WWF. We mobilized the business coalition for a global plastics treaty, and we starting from a common vision and kind of certain ambition level that all these companies share. We try and bring together the leading and most ambitious companies to actually call for an ambitious global treaty, which is a very interesting dynamic, in fact, to see businesses basically called to be regulated, right? We had a big campaign, the last negotiation round of the treaty in Ottawa. We had a big campaign, the video can be found on YouTube, but videos and billboards, etc., in Ottawa where the negotiations were taking place, where the headline was "Businesses Need Global Rules." And that was coming from businesses saying that, right? They say we need global rules. We actually want to be regulated because we have been working voluntarily through our work with the global commitment and the plastic pact, etc. We've been working voluntarily, and we've made progress in certain areas, but in other areas, including like reuse, etc., we're really facing some fundamental barriers, and we need policymakers to step in and level the playing field, come certain barriers. So that's been a very big change I've seen over the past 6, 7, 8 years, in particular the last 3, 4 years, is the stance companies are taking on policy, where by having tried many things and failed many things and facing these barriers, they're starting to realize, ooh, without policy, we're just not going to make it on some of these areas. So we absolutely need policy, and policy is not a bad thing. And in particular, in this global treaty level, knowing that plastics is rising high on the policy agenda, that there will inevitably, whether we have a good treaty or not, there will inevitably be more plastic policy coming in some way. But the real opportunity in the treaty is to accelerate that, but also to harmonize that, right? And that's a big fear for businesses, but also a big potential hurdle for actually creating a circular economy, that every country would start to go off in a completely different direction, that these global supply chains, or they don't even have to be global, but even like a regional supply chain that crosses a few boundaries of countries suddenly becomes incredibly complex if all these countries have completely different regulation, and in that country you need to go left, and in that country you need to go right, and that country whatever stimulates paper packaging, that one bans paper packaging with that application, and that one's, it becomes incredibly complex, and doesn't, it could slow down rather than accelerate the progress, right? So we definitely need more policy, more ambitious policy, but ideally there's also a certain degree of alignment and harmonization. I'm not saying it, will never be copy paste, but some high level principles and direction, etc., should be shared, and that's what we've been doing, I think, in a very powerful way, to have one collective business voice in that process, calling for high ambition, knowing that there's definitely other business as well as country voices who are significantly less ambitious. But having that business voice is really important, because it also gives policymakers the confidence that they not always these policymakers are experts on the topic, or they are definitely not active in the field on the ground. So hearing from these companies who are trying to actually do this on the ground, but this is actually helpful and we want you to do this, gives them confidence, say, oh, this is probably the right thing to do, and this is, this is possible, and this is helpful. So that's the confidence we're creating, both, I guess, informing them and giving them confidence to put in place more ambitious policies.
I presume you know this, but this is such music to my ears as a business person. You know, just harmonizing policies, because you're talking countries. You know, if it's states, in India or in US, two places where we are active, every state can have a different policy, and it's so harrowing to even get into it and to understand it and to comply with it. And it could be totally crazy to actually manage businesses where some state, even yesterday we were talking about PFAS, and like certain states want it, certain states have no concern, so you can't create different products for different places, and the price point changes and the whole chemistry changes. So as a business it becomes so challenging to actually operate. So yeah, if one thing that what you've talked about, and if one thing happens in Korea and they harmonize some policies at least, that will be a huge win itself for businesses. But let me put the question to you. So if you're looking at the next plastics treaty in Korea, what is the ideal state for you? What would you like to walk away with from Korea, and what would be the common global kind of ideal state that would be a prescription according to you?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, the negotiation route in Korea is planned to be the last one, and they hope to close the negotiations there. A lot of work is still on the table to do that. It's not necessarily the end state or the end stadium of the process. There's, again, all to be still decided in that agreement. But one possibility is that we go into a rhythm like we have for climate, where every year or every 2 years there's a COP process, and where we could work with a start and strengthen approach, where this agreement is a start, and at these biannual COPs or whatever, there is a possibility to increase the ambition level further along the way. We obviously still hope that there's a few global rules in the global treaty. That's not a given. There's still a set of countries advocating and kind of negotiating for not having any global rules, and say we can have maybe some, a bit like the Paris Agreement has no real global rules, so it has a high level target, 1.5 degree, but then every country kind of decides what and how they do to contribute to that. But we think we need to go further than that, and we really need some global rules on many fronts, and some are more likely than others. I think there's a few areas where there is fairly broad agreement, things like EPR policy, etc., and like the crucial role that plays in making the economics work, as we talked about earlier. Ideally, not sure how what will come out of negotiation, but ideally, kind of mandating EPR policy across the world in every country, and ideally even with a few basic principles of how the EPR policy is actually designed. We don't need to be 100% prescriptive on what every country needs to do, but if at least some basic principles are aligned, that would help a lot. But then, ideally there's global rules on reuse, on the reduction of production, etc. I think these things still face a bit more resistance from certain countries around the negotiation table. And then another one where there's maybe a bit more consensus, at least on principles, is kind of eliminating some avoidable or problematic items or substances. Again, the devil is in the detail on which items and which substances, and can they find agreements on that, and how much will it be legally binding versus a voluntary guidance document. Or so yeah, but we definitely hope to come out with a few actually legally binding global rules in there, but it can still go many directions. But it's we hope the negotiators do see that this is a despite the start and strengthening approach. So yes, you can strengthen over time, but this is still a unique moment in time opportunity to really put in place a framework and a structure that is strong and that sets us up to drive impact and to strengthen significantly over time.
Yeah, and I agree with you, of course. With the paucity of time, we won't get into EPR too much, but you've mentioned it a few times, and I do agree that if you place responsibility, then there is a higher chance of change. And like you said before, it's not really in the consumer's hand. The only thing that's in the consumer's hand is, am I going to buy that package of chips or that soft drink or not? That's the only thing I can choose. I cannot change the packaging there. So the only choice is that. So I'm glad that that is being pushed, and hopefully there'll be more action on that front, and of course making it more doable for the companies as well, and not just an economic exchange that, okay, I've committed to this much and I've paid and that's it, brush it off. So that's the damage that can happen. But okay, staying away from that, a couple of questions to kind of end the conversation. The one which I've been actually wanting to ask you from the beginning, but I kept it for the end, is that you actually talk to so many organizations and look at so many technologies. If you were to choose maybe three that you're most optimistic about, that these are the three, and I'm sticking to packaging. So these are the three technologies slash products that you would love to have scale in the next 4 to 5 years. What would those be? And yeah, tell us more about, choose three and tell us how you would like them to scale.
That's a really difficult one. Yeah, because you obviously use packaging for everything from toothpaste to food to TVs to everything comes in packaging, right? So big three solutions. I mean, I always love it when you see solutions that are seemingly simple, and where you think about why didn't we do that earlier, right? And typically they involve, again, more than just redesigning the packaging and thinking more broadly. And there are these multiple innovators who have these edible coatings they put on fresh fruit and vegetables, to keep them safe and fresh without the need for packaging altogether. So that's kind of one example of completely new ways of keeping products fresh. Yeah, like I mentioned with toothpaste, etc. Like, rather than spending ages redesigning the tube, what about toothpaste tablets or other ways? Again, those type of things. I do believe in reuse. It will be a difficult transition in terms of you need new infrastructure, you need major investments, etc. But I see hopeful signals. I mean, one is of course the fact that those, for beverage industry in particular, that still exists in many countries. It's typically legacy systems that existed for decades, and it's possible. But also, like, the work that's happening in France by Citeo now is really going beyond what we've seen from pilots. Like, they see small city pilots, whatever. But this is really, they're talking hundreds of millions of investments to roll out a full reuse collection and logistic infrastructure for the entire country. It's embedded in, CTO is the PRO, the EPR organization. A certain percentage of their EPR fees is kind of dedicated to reuse now, so it creates real scaled funding into those systems. And if you talk to them, this is no longer really, I mean, of course, they will go through stages of scaling it, but this is not. This is different from what we've seen before of projects that are really positioned as pilots, and we're going to do something small scale, test and learn, which again is fine, and we need to do that. But this is really, this has a whole plan, a timeline to scale to the whole country. They're talking with options to finance this at a very large scale, and they're going to roll out in 4 big regions in the country already, more than 1,000 stores across the country as of May next year. So this type of really at scale investments and projects make me hopeful that I'm really hoping that one's really successful, and that can be give a big boost in confidence to other countries and other regions to start that, because it is not easy to get off the ground. You need a few elements to come together, and in this case you had the policymaker creating reuse targets, reuse incentives. You had that EPR organization willing to work. You need to have a few key retailers on board who want to jump into the story. You need to find some funders who want to put money into it. And but if you really put yourself to it, that's what they're proving, and work hard, because they've been working on this for over a year already, and it takes time. But if you focus on it and put the right people together, it's possible. And I do believe, despite the need for large scale to get the real benefits out of it, I do believe that's very much possible. And so definitely reuse would be one of these 3 things that I'd love to see scaled in the near future.
I love your answer because, interestingly, all 3 things you mentioned were looking at it from a systems perspective. They didn't, the simple answer would have been that, okay, replace plastic with a seaweed, right? But it's still the same issue that, what you mentioned initially, like it's still a toothpaste tube, right? In the end, and there is the challenge of end of use, and here you tackle the end of use right at the design stage, rather than at the end. And interesting, as you were mentioning that, there was somebody who actually mentioned to me last week, about a paper bottle. And I was just like, aghast. I was like, we don't want to work on that. And they were like, why? You do molded fiber. I said, every paper bottle, one, I think you're making it more complicated because you have a liner inside that, instead of a mono-material, it becomes a multi-layered material. And then you again have the challenge of disposal. Go to reuse. Exactly what I said. Like I said, growing up, we as kids were so excited to collect glass bottles because we would get that 10 paisa in India back. So that was our pocket money. If we collected 20 bottles, we had 2 rupees in our pocket. So it was the economic excitement of that. And then they would be reused. And I had friends who were bottling, and they said the maximum damage is 2 to 5%. So that's not bad if they get 95% of their material back and keep, like you said, 1,000 times, keep rotating it. So I love those answers. And of course, all good things have to come to an end. And this is my final question to you, and I'm excited to hear, what does good garbage mean to you?
Yeah, for me, good garbage means no garbage, because I knew from previous episodes this would be the last question. Alex told me that would be. So I just Googled the word garbage and looked for the definition, and it said something like worthless, meaningless products or materials. So for me, good garbage, is no garbage. Like we shouldn't have worthless stuff. Like everything, even if it comes to the end of a certain use cycle, should have some value and should have value and to be circulated and kept in the economy. So good garbage is no garbage.
Thank you so much, Sander. This has been such a wonderful conversation for me. It's actually been such a learning experience, and it's taken me back to the thinking of systems rather than thinking just from a product perspective. And, kind of you start there, but at some point you get jaded and you just want to run your business, right? And, you think about this, that, what all are you going to tackle? But then it's not about what all you're going to tackle, but the same end goal that you're trying to achieve can also be achieved through systems thinking. So thank you for putting that perspective. I'm definitely hoping that more and more people would listen to this and get that perspective so that there can be a broader change. But thank you for the work you're doing. Of course, big fan of Ellen MacArthur and the work and the whole chain reaction that she's put in place. So thank you for the work you all do. And I wish you all the very best for the coming plastic treaty and beyond. So thank you for being on the show.
Super, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.